The cabin had been a dream for as long as they could remember. They had spent years imagining a place far from the noise and chaos of the city, somewhere quiet and peaceful, where mornings began with birdsong, and evenings ended with the soft splash of water against the shore. Every time they thought about it, they pictured a small wooden cabin tucked among tall pine trees, smoke curling from the chimney in winter, and a little dock stretching into a lake so clear it reflected the sky like glass. They had seen pictures online for years, scrolling through endless listings and imagining themselves there. Finally, after months of searching and saving, they found it. It was almost too perfect. A modest cabin, sturdy and well-kept, with a porch that wrapped around the front and side, offering views of the lake from every angle. The wood had aged beautifully, the natural grain giving it a warm, lived-in feeling. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and cedar, with sunlight streaming through large windows lighting up the simple, comfortable furniture. The walls were lined with shelves that begged for books, and the small kitchen had enough space for simple meals without feeling cramped. Everything about it felt right. When they first stepped out onto the porch looking at the lake shimmering under the late afternoon sun, a feeling of relief washed over them. They had imagined this moment countless times, but now it was real. There was a rowboat tied to the dock, and the water lapped gently against the wooden posts. A small path wound through the trees, disappearing into the forest, promising morning walks and quiet reflection. For the first time in years, they felt like they had a place to call their own, a true escape from the stress and demands of city life. Buying the cabin was not simple. It had taken months of paperwork, inspections, and negotiations. Every phone call with the real estate agent seemed to drag on forever, and there were nights spent staring at numbers and documents, wondering if this dream was worth the sacrifice. But in the end, it had been worth it. There was something about owning a piece of land, a real place in the world that was theirs, that brought a sense of accomplishment they had never felt before. The first weekend at the cabin was magical. They arrived early Friday afternoon, the car packed with a cooler, blankets, and everything they thought they would need for a short getaway. The drive from the city had been long, winding through small towns and forests, but it had given them time to mentally shed the worries of their usual life. When they finally pulled into the gravel driveway, the scent of pine filled the air and the distant sound of water promised peace. They unpacked quickly, eager to settle in, and as the sun dipped toward the horizon, they lit a small fire in the fireplace and sat on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The nights were quiet, almost unnaturally so after years of honking cars and construction noise. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves, the call of an owl somewhere in the trees, and the gentle lapping of the lake. Sleep came easily, unbroken and deep, and they woke the next morning to a soft golden light spilling through the windows. Coffee in hand, they stepped onto the porch again and breathed deeply. For the first time in a long time, life felt simple. Days passed like this in a way that felt almost suspended from reality. Morning walks along the lake became a ritual. They would watch ducks glide across the water, see deer stepping carefully through the forest, and notice the tiniest details. A spider web catching the morning dew, the smell of wildflowers along the path, the way the sunlight made the water sparkle. Afternoons were for reading, painting, or simply sitting on the dock with bare feet dangling in the water. Evenings brought sunsets that made the sky look like it had been painted by hand, and nights ended with the warm glow of the fireplace and the comforting crackle of logs burning. It was during one of these afternoons that they first met a neighbor, someone who lived just a few cabins down. They were friendly, waving from a distance at first, then stopping by with a basket of homemade cookies. Conversation flowed easily, full of shared stories about fishing, hiking trails, and local events. It felt good to belong even in such a small way. The neighbor mentioned the local homeowners association casually, talking about meetings and rules, but it seemed like a minor part of life here. For now it didn't matter. The cabin was theirs, and nothing could spoil the simple joy of being there. However, it wasn't long before small things began to surface. A letter arrived one morning, crisp and official, from the HOA. They opened it with curiosity, expecting perhaps a welcome note or information about local events. Instead, the letter was full of rules, regulations, and mentions of compliance issues. The language was polite but firm, instructing them to adjust small things on the property. Something about the placement of outdoor decorations, the height of a flower bed, and other minor details they hadn't even noticed. It was confusing. Nothing about these things had been mentioned when they bought the cabin. The feeling of excitement they had felt just days before started to waver. At first, they tried to follow the rules, moving small items, adjusting plants, and making sure everything looked exactly like the HOA expected. But every change seemed to bring a new letter or a new complaint. What had been a peaceful escape began to feel like a test, a series of hoops they had to jump through just to enjoy their own property. They began to notice the subtle tension that came with living in a place where someone else's opinion could dictate how they use their land. Still, they tried to focus on the positive. The lake was beautiful, the cabin was comfortable, and the freedom of the outdoors was worth the hassle. Weekends were spent exploring trails, fishing off the dock, and occasionally boating across the lake. They took photographs of sunsets, sketches of the cabin, and notes about birds and plants they saw. Friends came to visit, sharing meals on the porch, laughter echoing across the water. The cabin was alive with the feeling of home, even as the shadow of the HOA began to loom in the background. It was during one particular evening that the first real confrontation occurred. They had planted a small flower bed near the porch, something they thought would brighten the space. The flowers were cheerful, red and yellow blooms swaying in the gentle breeze. They were proud of it, imagining the joy it would bring over the coming weeks. That night, a letter arrived in the mailbox, written in the same crisp official tone as before. It stated that the flower bed violated HOA guidelines and demanded its removal. The words stung, not because of the flowers themselves, but because of the sense that someone was trying to control even the smallest details of their life here. They had worked hard to create this little piece of paradise, and now it felt as though someone was trying to take it away. Not through violence or theft, but through rules and bureaucracy. That night, lying awake in the cabin, they felt a mixture of anger and determination. They weren't going to let this ruin their dream. The following days were filled with research. They read through every page of the HOA documents, searched for precedents, and even reached out to other neighbors who had dealt with similar issues. What they discovered was surprising. There were indeed rules, but there were also inconsistencies and loopholes. Some neighbors had made changes without complaint, and certain rules had never been enforced consistently. A plan began to form, not one of confrontation for the sake of conflict, but of careful understanding, so that they could protect their right to enjoy the cabin they had fought so hard to get. Even with this growing tension, the beauty of the cabin and the surrounding nature remained. Mornings were still filled with the soft sounds of birds and water. Afternoons brought fishing trips and hikes, and evenings held the quiet satisfaction of watching the sun set behind the trees. The struggle with the HOA added a new layer of complexity, but it did not erase the joy they found here. In fact, it strengthened their resolve. This was their home, even if only for weekends, and they would not let it be taken lightly. By the end of that first month, they had settled into a rhythm. The letters from the HOA were still there, but now they were read with a calm determination rather than panic. They documented everything, took notes, and prepared to defend their space. The cabin had become more than a dream. It was a place of personal triumph and resilience. Every walk along the lake, every quiet moment on the porch was a reminder that this was worth fighting for. They didn't yet know what lay ahead, but they felt ready. The cabin had already given them something priceless, a sense of peace, a sense of control over their own little world, and a reminder that perseverance could turn a dream into reality. The conflict with the HOA was only the beginning, a challenge to navigate carefully, but it could not overshadow the simple, profound joy of owning a place that felt like home. And so, as the moon rose over the lake, reflecting silver light across the water, they sat on the porch, sipping coffee and listening to the gentle lapping of waves. This was their cabin, their escape, and they were determined to protect it no matter what. The dream had begun, and nothing could take away the feeling of finally being exactly where they belonged. Life at the cabin had settled into a rhythm, at least on the surface. Mornings were still peaceful, with the sun spilling gold across the lake and birds darting among the trees. Afternoons were spent fishing, sketching, or hiking the trails that wound through the forest. But beneath the calm, a tension had begun to creep in. Every time they checked the mailbox or opened a new letter, their heart sank a little. The HOA was watching, and it wasn't content to let them enjoy their cabin in peace. It started with small things, letters tucked in the mailbox that felt polite but firm. The flower bed had been the first target, but soon other minor details were scrutinized. The cabin's porch furniture, a small shed for tools, even the way the firewood was stacked became points of concern. Each time the tone was the same. Please make adjustments to comply with HOA guidelines. The letters never sounded threatening, but the subtext was clear. This was someone trying to control every detail of their property. And then came the face of that control. Karen. She was a neighbor. Yes, but more importantly, she was an active and intimidating member of the HOA. From the first time they met her, it was clear she liked to be in charge. She smiled politely, but her eyes carried a sharpness, a sense that she was constantly measuring people against some invisible standard. When she waved hello from a distance, it felt more like an inspection than a friendly greeting. At first, they tried to ignore it, reminding themselves that she was just one person and the cabin was theirs. But ignoring Karen proved impossible. She appeared in the driveway one afternoon, clipboard in hand, ready to inspect the property. Her tone was casual, but her words were loaded. She asked questions about the flower bed, commented on the angle of the porch furniture, and suggested adjustments to the small shed that seemed absurd. Every suggestion was framed as concern for community standards, but it felt more like an attempt to assert power. They tried to reason with her politely. I didn't realize these were issues. I'll take care of them, they said, hoping to diffuse the tension. Karen smiled, nodded, and left. But the next week, another letter arrived with new complaints. It was becoming clear that no amount of compliance would satisfy her. The more they tried to follow the rules, the more rules seemed to appear. Friends who visited the cabin noticed the strain. You look tense, one said as they unpacked fishing gear. Is everything okay with the neighbors? They laughed at first, brushing it off, but inside the frustration was growing. They had bought this cabin to escape stress, not to face it in the form of overbearing letters and constant scrutiny. The first real confrontation came on a quiet Saturday morning. They were watering the small garden when a car pulled into the driveway. Karen stepped out, not waiting for a greeting, and approached with the air of someone delivering judgment. She held a folder filled with papers and immediately began listing complaints, pointing to every detail she found unacceptable. The shed is too close to the property line, she said, tapping a corner of the small structure. And these flowers, did you check the HOA guidelines? They're not approved. She circled the porch furniture with a critical eye. Even this arrangement violates community standards. You need to adjust everything immediately. They took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I understand, Karen, but I've read the guidelines carefully. I don't see any rules about flower types or the exact placement of furniture. I want to comply, but I'm not sure what exactly needs changing. Karen frowned, her smile fading. It's not just about the rules. It's about maintaining the look and feel of the community. I suggest you follow my instructions. Otherwise, her voice trailed off, leaving the threat unspoken but unmistakable. The confrontation left them shaken. For the first time, they realized that this wasn't going to be resolved with polite compliance. Karen was relentless, and her idea of community standards seemed endless and ever-changing. They spent the rest of the day thinking about their options, feeling a mix of frustration, anger, and determination. Over the next few weeks, the letters continued to arrive. Each one was carefully worded, citing rules, offering suggestions, and implying consequences if they failed to comply. They spent hours reading HOA documents, trying to understand exactly what they could and couldn't do. They spoke with neighbors who had dealt with Karen before, gathering stories of similar experiences. Some had given in, rearranging gardens, repainting shutters, and adjusting decorations to avoid conflict. Others had resisted, only to face endless complaints and fines. It became clear that Karen was not just enforcing rules. She was controlling her neighborhood. She seemed to take pleasure in pointing out minor infractions, as if each one was proof of her authority. And yet, despite all her efforts, there were inconsistencies. Some neighbors had been allowed to make similar changes without a single word of complaint. Others had skirted rules entirely, and Karen had done nothing. This inconsistency made it obvious that the issue was personal, not procedural. They decided that they would not back down, not quietly. The cabin was theirs, and they had worked too hard to let someone else dictate how they lived there. But they also knew they had to be smart. Karen was formidable, and any direct confrontation could backfire. So they began documenting everything: letters, photos of the property, notes about conversations, and records of their attempts to comply. They wanted a clear record in case the situation escalated. The tension affected even the small joys of cabin life. Mornings of peaceful coffee on the porch were now shadowed by worry about what letter might appear next. Afternoons fishing on the lake were sometimes interrupted by thoughts of the next complaint. Even friends noticed the change. "You used to be so relaxed here," one remarked, helping set up chairs on the dock. "Now you seem on edge." They smiled, trying to hide their frustration, but it was true. Karen had managed to turn what was supposed to be an escape into a source of stress. Despite the constant pressure, they refused to let Karen ruin their connection to the cabin. They doubled down on the routines that brought them joy. Morning walks along the lake, quiet afternoons reading by the fireplace, evenings listening to the gentle lapping of water. These moments became a kind of rebellion, small acts of defiance that reminded them that the cabin belonged to them. They also began learning more about HOA laws and regulations. They discovered that while associations could enforce certain rules, they had limits. Many of Karen's complaints relied on vague interpretations rather than clear violations. This knowledge gave them confidence. They realized that they could protect themselves legally, and that Karen's power was not absolute. One weekend, while rearranging a small flower bed to comply with a previous letter, they saw Karen walking along the path toward their cabin. Her expression was sharp, her clipboard in hand. But this time, instead of anxiety, they felt readiness. They calmly greeted her, explaining that they had read the guidelines and adjusted the garden as requested. Karen examined it briefly, then scribbled something on her clipboard. "This will do, for now," she said, her tone tight. "But remember, we expect full compliance with all community rules at all times." She turned and walked back down the path, leaving behind a tension that lingered like smoke. They breathed deeply, realizing that the battle was far from over, but also feeling a surge of resolve. They would not be intimidated. The days that followed were filled with planning and preparation. They spoke with neighbors who had successfully challenged unreasonable HOA actions, gathering advice and strategies. They learned to respond to letters calmly and formally, keeping a paper trail and documenting every interaction. It was a new way of living at the cabin, not just enjoying nature, but defending it, protecting the little paradise they had worked so hard to create. By the end of the month, the pattern was clear. Karen would continue her inspections, her letters, and her attempts at control. But now the protagonist was ready. They had a strategy, a record, and a determination that matched her persistence. What had once been a simple escape into nature had transformed into a test of patience, courage, and intelligence. They had learned that even in the most beautiful and peaceful places, challenges could arise, and that standing up for oneself was sometimes part of the journey. And through it all, the cabin remained beautiful. The lake sparkled under the sun, the forest whispered with life, and the porch still offered the perfect view for sunsets. Each day they reminded themselves why they had come here: to find peace, to reclaim a sense of control, and to enjoy the simple joys of life. Karen's interference was a challenge, but it could not take away the feeling of finally being somewhere that felt like home. Sitting on the dock one evening, watching the sky turn shades of orange and purple, they made a quiet promise to themselves. They would not let fear or intimidation drive them away. This cabin, this land was theirs to enjoy, and they would find a way to protect it. The first confrontation with Karen had shown them the difficulty ahead, but it had also shown them their own strength. They were determined to defend what they had earned, and in doing so, they began to feel a sense of power they had never experienced before. The lake reflected the colors of the sky, calm and steady, as if reassuring them that life could still be beautiful despite challenges. With a deep breath, they stood, stretching and looking around. The tension with Karen had not eased. Every morning, the protagonist would wake up to the same feeling, a mix of peace from the lake and apprehension about what the day might bring. The cabin, still beautiful and full of life, now carried a layer of unease. They had realized that escaping the city had not meant escaping stress entirely. Instead, it had shifted to a new kind, one rooted in confrontation and control. But they were learning to face it, slowly gaining confidence that they could protect their little paradise. After several letters and confrontations, they decided that waiting and reacting was no longer enough. They needed a plan, a way to respond effectively if Karen tried to escalate the situation. The first step was information. They began reading every HOA document they could find, from the original covenants and restrictions to meeting minutes and past correspondence. What had seemed like an endless wall of legalese at first slowly started to make sense. They noticed inconsistencies in rules, vague wording, and areas where enforcement had been irregular. They also spoke to neighbors, but cautiously. Some had dealt with Karen for years and warned them that she could be relentless. She picked small things to make a point, one neighbor said, leaning over a fence as they exchanged stories. But she doesn't always know the law herself. That's your advantage if you're careful. Another neighbor admitted that they had once tried to ignore Karen, only to be pulled into months of back-and-forth letters and fines. From these conversations, the protagonist learned two things. Karen was persistent, and knowledge was power. With this information in hand, they started to create a record of every interaction. They kept copies of letters, photographs of the property, and notes on each conversation. They also began to draft responses to future letters, careful to remain polite but firm. Their tone was professional, free of emotion or hostility, but clearly showing that they knew their rights. For the first time, they felt a sense of control over the situation, rather than feeling like a passive target of Karen's constant scrutiny. One morning, a new letter arrived. Karen had noticed that a small stack of firewood had been moved slightly closer to the property line than she considered acceptable. She demanded immediate correction, citing a section of the HOA guidelines that was vague at best. Normally, this would have caused a surge of anxiety, but now the protagonist was ready. They photographed the firewood from multiple angles, showing that it was entirely safe, and wrote a detailed, calm letter referencing the guidelines and asking for clarification. They also included a note that all previous adjustments had been completed in good faith. Days passed without a response. For the first time, the absence of a reply felt like a small victory. Karen had sent her warning, but there was no immediate retaliation. It was a quiet reminder that knowledge and preparation could shift the balance of power. The protagonist began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer reacting. They were actively managing the situation. The cabin, their escape, was still theirs to enjoy, and they were learning to protect it without letting fear take over. Their weekends returned to a rhythm of both work and relaxation. Mornings were still filled with coffee on the porch and walks along the lake. But now there were afternoons dedicated to research, phone calls to lawyers, and drafting documents. Evenings became a mix of fishing and reviewing HOA regulations. Friends who visited were impressed by the way they had transformed frustration into action. "You've got this handled," one remarked, watching as they organized letters and photographs at the kitchen table. "It's like you've become your own lawyer." And in a way, they had. They learned to spot the weak points in Karen's arguments and letters. Every ambiguous rule became an opportunity to push back gently but firmly. They realized that while Karen had authority, she could not bend the law to her will. There were limits, and understanding those limits was the key to standing their ground. Then came the first major test. A letter arrived that seemed more serious than previous ones. Karen claimed the cabin violated a section of the rules regarding exterior modifications. The wording suggested that fines could begin immediately, and that eviction proceedings might be considered. The protagonist felt a moment of fear, but it was tempered by the preparation they had done. They knew that the threat was likely exaggerated, and that the rules cited were not as absolute as Karen made them sound. They decided to take action immediately. They contacted a lawyer who specialized in property disputes and HOA matters. The lawyer explained the steps they could take: formal documentation, a request for clarification, and, if necessary, a legal challenge to any unfair actions. They also emphasized that maintaining a calm and professional tone in all communication was crucial. The protagonist followed this advice carefully, drafting a response that was factual, polite, and unyielding. Karen did not respond immediately. Instead, she escalated in person. One sunny afternoon, she drove down the gravel path to the cabin again, her expression sharper than ever. She carried a folder full of papers and approached with the air of someone delivering a verdict. But this time, the protagonist was ready. They greeted her politely, offering a smile and a cup of iced tea as a small gesture of civility. Karen ignored the gesture, launching straight into her list of complaints. The protagonist listened carefully, taking notes and responding calmly to each point. When she mentioned the exterior modifications, they referenced the exact section of the HOA guidelines, showing that their cabin did not violate the rules. They also included photographs and records of previous adjustments. Karen's frown deepened as she flipped through the folder. There was no argument to make. Every claim had been addressed thoroughly and professionally. After a long pause, Karen closed her folder and muttered something about expecting compliance in the future, before walking back to her car. The encounter left the protagonist both exhausted and exhilarated. They had faced the confrontation head-on and had not been intimidated. For the first time, they felt that they could truly protect their property. It was a turning point, a moment where preparation and knowledge overcame fear and aggression. The weeks that followed were different. Karen continued her watchful presence, but the protagonist noticed a subtle shift. Her letters became less frequent, and when she did communicate, they were more cautious, almost defensive. It was as if she had realized that they were no longer easy to intimidate. This change was a small but meaningful victory, showing that persistence and preparation could alter the dynamics of power. During this time, the protagonist also began to think about the long-term future. They realized that their property was not just a cabin, it was a part of their life, a place to build memories and enjoy freedom. The struggle with Karen, while stressful, had taught them valuable lessons about resilience, strategy, and the importance of standing up for oneself. They began to see that the conflict was not just about a flower bed or a shed, but about protecting personal space and asserting boundaries. They also discovered a sense of creativity and problem-solving. When faced with ambiguous rules, they learned to interpret them carefully, finding solutions that satisfied the HOA without compromising their enjoyment of the cabin. They rearranged furniture, adjusted landscaping subtly, and documented every change, turning what had once felt like harassment into an exercise in strategic thinking. The cabin became a classroom for learning patience, cleverness, and resourcefulness. One evening, sitting on the dock with the lake reflecting the sunset, they reflected on how far they had come. The fear and frustration that had once dominated their weekends were now tempered by confidence and preparation. They had learned that the cabin was more than a property. It was a place where they could grow, adapt, and assert control over their own life. Karen's interference was no longer a looming threat, but a challenge they could manage with strategy and foresight. Friends who visited noticed the change as well. They commented on the calm determination, the way the protagonist could handle tension without being drawn into drama. "It's like you found your footing," one said, tossing a pebble into the lake. "You're not just surviving here, you're thriving." The protagonist smiled, knowing it was true. The cabin had always been a dream, but now it was also a place of empowerment. By the end of this chapter of their life at the cabin, they were not only enjoying nature and tranquility, but also mastering the art of negotiation and preparation. The confrontation with Karen had forced them to grow in ways they hadn't anticipated. They had become meticulous, observant, and confident in asserting their rights. What had begun as a dream interrupted by an overbearing neighbor had transformed into an opportunity to learn resilience, patience, and strategy. The cabin remained a sanctuary. Mornings were still peaceful, afternoons full of quiet activity, and evenings painted with stunning sunsets. The fire crackled in the fireplace as they reflected on the growth and lessons of the past weeks. Karen, once a source of constant stress, had inadvertently helped them develop skills they never imagined needing. The struggle had sharpened their mind and strengthened their resolve, and in that quiet moment, looking across the lake, they understood something important. The cabin was theirs, not just in ownership, but in spirit. No letter, no complaint, no overbearing neighbor coup. The days at the cabin had become a balance between peaceful enjoyment and careful vigilance. After weeks of preparing, documenting, and learning the HOA rules, the protagonist had grown confident in handling Karen's constant scrutiny. Yet there was still a sense of unease, a feeling that Karen was always lurking, ready to pounce on the smallest perceived mistake. Every letter, every glance from a passing neighbor reminded them that the fight for their property was not over. It was during one of these routine mornings, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, that they noticed something unusual. Across the lake at the far edge of the community, a for sale sign had appeared on a large property. At first they barely paid attention, thinking it was just another listing in the area. But as they squinted in the sunlight, they realized something shocking. The lot belonged to Karen. She had been quietly selling her lakefront property, the very lot that commanded the best view, the easiest access to the water, and the most space. The revelation sparked a mix of curiosity and cautious excitement. They had not been thinking about buying additional property, yet here was an opportunity that seemed almost fated. Owning Karen's lake lot would not only be a strategic move, but also provide a sense of justice for the months of intimidation and conflict. They felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with disbelief. Could this really be happening? Could they, against all odds, claim the very land that had symbolized Karen's authority? Before making any decisions, they began researching immediately. They wanted to understand why the lot was being sold. A quick visit to the local property office revealed that Karen had indeed fallen behind on property taxes, creating an opening for a buyer. Other details indicated that she had not maintained the lot in accordance with certain community rules, meaning the sale was urgent and non-negotiable. They knew they needed to act fast. Timing would be everything. They spent the next few days preparing, studying the legalities of the purchase, the procedures for acquiring the lot, and the potential costs involved. It was a mix of excitement and nervousness. The idea of buying Karen's property felt almost like a twist of fate. They felt like a character in a story where the long-standing antagonist might finally face an unexpected consequence. Yet they also reminded themselves to stay focused, to be careful and strategic. One misstep could jeopardize everything. When the day arrived to submit an offer, they approached it with precision. Every form was completed accurately, every payment verified, and every rule followed to the letter. There was no room for error. They had learned from weeks of dealing with Karen that attention to detail mattered more than speed. But in this case, both were essential. They submitted the offer and waited, a mix of anticipation and anxiety keeping them on edge. Within a few days, the call came. Their offer had been accepted. The lakefront property was theirs. They could hardly believe it at first. The same person who had tried to intimidate them, who had scrutinized every minor detail of their cabin, had now lost control of the most desirable property in the neighborhood. It was a remarkable reversal, one that filled them with a mix of triumph, relief, and satisfaction. The reality of ownership began to sink in over the next week. Walking the new property, they noticed the potential immediately. The lot was spacious with tall trees lining the edges, a gentle slope leading down to the water, and enough room to add small features without disturbing the natural beauty. The lake itself was calm and clear, perfect for boating, fishing, or just enjoying the quiet mornings. Every step they took felt like reclaiming a piece of freedom that Karen had once tried to control. Karen, of course, was not pleased. It did not take long for her to realize that the sale had gone through, and that her former lakefront property now belonged to the very person she had tried to intimidate. The first time she saw them walking the property with a surveyor, her expression was a mix of anger, disbelief, and frustration. She tried to approach, but the protagonist remained calm and composed, refusing to engage in confrontation. The satisfaction of legal ownership outweighed the need for argument. From that moment on, the dynamics between them shifted dramatically. Karen's attempts to influence the protagonist's cabin seemed smaller, less threatening. She had lost the ultimate leverage, the very property that symbolized power in the community. The protagonist now had not only their cabin, but also the lake lot, creating a buffer that rendered her previous intimidation largely ineffective. The sense of security was almost overwhelming. They spent the following weeks exploring the possibilities of the new lot. They walked the shoreline, measured areas for potential gardens, and imagined small docks and seating areas. The property was more than a reward. It was a canvas, a place to expand their dream without the constraints they had faced at the cabin alone. Even Karen's presence in the community now felt diminished. She could no longer dominate through fear, as they had claimed the physical space that had once symbolized her authority. During this period, the protagonist also reflected on what had brought them here. The struggle with Karen had been challenging, often frustrating, and at times exhausting. Yet it had forced them to grow, to learn patience, strategic thinking, and confidence in standing their ground. Without those weeks of tension, they might not have been prepared to act decisively when the opportunity for the lake lot appeared. In a strange way, the conflict had prepared them for this moment. Friends and neighbors began to notice the change as well. Conversations shifted, and there was a newfound respect for the protagonist's ability to navigate complex situations while maintaining composure. Some neighbors quietly admitted that they had doubted whether anyone could ever stand up to Karen, and yet here was proof that careful preparation, knowledge, and perseverance could overcome even the most overbearing adversary. The protagonist also started thinking creatively about how to use the lot. They didn't just want it as a symbol of victory, they wanted it to enhance their life. Plans formed slowly, ideas for quiet spots along the water, a small dock for morning rowing, and seating areas for watching sunsets. They imagined evenings by a fire, the lake reflecting stars overhead, and days filled with nature free from fear and tension. The possibilities were endless, and each step they took on the property felt like reclaiming peace. One evening, as they stood on the shoreline, watching the water ripple in the wind, they realized just how much their life had changed. What had started as a simple dream of a quiet cabin had evolved into a broader vision of freedom, strategy, and accomplishment. They had faced intimidation, learned to protect themselves, and now held ownership of a property that represented both joy and victory. The feeling was almost surreal. Karen, meanwhile, tried in small ways to reassert herself, but it was no longer the same. Letters about minor infractions became less frequent, and she seemed hesitant when she saw them walking across the lot. There was no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted. The protagonist felt a sense of calm confidence. They had acted decisively, legally, and with patience, and the results were undeniable. The lake lot also offered an opportunity for connection rather than conflict. They invited friends over, sharing meals and laughter by the water, exploring small trails and enjoying the sunsets together. For the first time, the property felt like a true extension of their life, not just a strategic victory. The joy of nature, combined with the sense of accomplishment, created a rare kind of happiness, one that was both quiet and deep. In the following months, they carefully maintained both the cabin and the lake lot. The flower beds were flourishing, the firewood stacked neatly, and the docks kept in perfect order. They documented everything, not because they expected conflict, but because they had learned the value of preparation. Every morning on the porch, with coffee in hand and the lake stretching out before them, they felt a sense of ownership, not just of land, but of life, calm, and security. The experience also brought reflection. They thought about the lessons learned through confrontation, the importance of patience, strategy, knowledge, and calm action. They realized that fear and intimidation could be countered with preparation, and that even the most overbearing adversaries could be outmaneuvered if approached wisely. It was a lesson they would carry for years, applicable not just to property disputes but to challenges in life in general. By the end of this chapter, the protagonist had not only secured physical space, but had also claimed a psychological victory. The cabin remained their retreat, and the lake lot became a symbol of persistence and clever action. The combination created a new sense of freedom and confidence that was deeply satisfying. They had faced adversity, responded with strategy and care, and now enjoyed the rewards in full. As they sat on the new dock one evening, the sun sinking behind the trees, they looked across the lake at the cabin where the conflict had begun. A small smile formed, a mixture of relief and triumph. The cabin and the lake lot were theirs, legally and peacefully, and the struggle with Karen had taught them that calm determination could overcome even the most relentless opposition. The water glimmered in the fading light, reflecting the sky, the trees, and their own sense of accomplishment. The protagonist understood that the journey was as important as the DO,